stop sharing, and I'll do a brief introduction, and then Joyce, I'll hand it over to you and you can start sharing on your end. So I'm really excited and pleased to have Dr. Joyce White joining us today as a guest lecturer. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where she wrote her dissertation on the site of Ban Chiang, which we've been reading and talking about a lot, and also got a chance to see artifacts from there on Monday. She's currently a consulting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and she's director of the Ban Chiang project. And she's been working tirelessly, I think, on documenting the research from that site, and most recently has been publishing a 4-volume set on all of the metal remains and interpretation about metallurgy at the site. So I know that you read a chapter from one of her volumes a couple weeks ago. In addition to her work on Ban Chiang, she also is director and principal investigator of the Middle Mekong Archaeological Project in Laos, which is looking at human habitation in the middle reaches of the Mekong River from the late Pleistocene to the late Holocene. She's also the founder and executive director of the Institute for Southeast Asian Archaeology, which is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to multidisciplinary investigation of Southeast Asia's archaeological past in order to advance that knowledge for the benefit of both scholars and the public. And the bibliographic database is one part of the work that she's been doing with that. Again, I think that'll be a great resource for all of you. In addition to her research on prehistoric metallurgy and lifeways in mainland Southeast Asia, Dr. White has also been involved, as you read about, the Operation Antiquity case and dealing with issues of repatriation, acting as an expert witness for the U.S. Justice Department's Operation Antiquity case. So one of the reasons why I was really excited, why I wanted to invite Dr. White here, and I'm excited she's able to join us, is because her work really speaks to so many different components of this class and the things that we're talking about in this class. So when I asked her to speak, I kind of threw a lot at her where I was like, can you talk about your bronze work? Can you also talk about Operation Antiquity? And can you also just kind of give an overview of your kind of career in Southeast Asian archaeology, which is a lot to ask of her, but I think she's going to have a lot of really wonderful and fascinating insights for us today. And then we should have time to go over some of your questions as well after she completes her lecture. So with that, Joyce, welcome, and I will hand the floor over to you and you can go ahead and share your screen.
Oops, where did it go? Disappeared. Excuse me. Here we are. Oops. Let's see where, this is very bizarre.
Sometimes I just have to close out PowerPoint and reopen it. And then if you do that, you can go back to your share screen and it should pop up.
Let me try that. It was there before. Okay, let me close this and then do share screen again. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
We found it before. I'm going to let me open it again. I'm perplexed.
So when you pop up the share screen, does it at the bottom of the Zoom, and does it pop up and show PowerPoint as one of the windows you can share?
I have several PowerPoints, but not the one that I showed you earlier. So let me try closing these other PowerPoints. I'm sorry. Let me close. Close. Okay, try this again. Okay, close this again and go back. Here we are. Share. Okay.
All right, that looks good from here.
Okay, so I'm delighted to have this opportunity. I have to say the questions from the class were really outstanding. So I hope I can address at least some of them during the presentation. So doing Southeast Asian archaeology, as you just heard, I've been doing it a long time and have many different facets. I can only give you a few tidbits really about the different facets. And I'm going to start at grad school. I came to grad school at Penn in 1974, and I was expecting to specialize in European archaeology. And that only lasted a month or two because I quickly got a job with Chet Gorman, and who was he had completed some research in Northwest Thailand at a place called Spirit Cave. Whoops, I'm sorry. Try this again. And he was about to embark on an excavation at Ban Chiang. And I heard talks that he gave, and I just said, that's me, I want to do that. So I think if you read one of the articles that was assigned, that Allison assigned, that Dr. Carter assigned, he said, sorry, I don't take female students. And I just persisted, and it was, I just was totally fascinated. And I call it bit by the bug, and was hooked. So I had a lot of ups and downs in grad school. But one of the most important experiences was that I ran the Ban Chiang lab for a couple of years before beginning my dissertation research. And so that involved a lot of dealing with the bags of artifacts that were, this is actually a field picture, but they were brought to Penn Museum and put in shelves, and then slowly we started putting the pots together. And there was a lot of organization involved, and how to record what bags were open and who was working on which burial. And so it was that really couple of in-depth hands-on time spent working with the materials that gave me the in-depth knowledge of the material culture. However, I wanted to do my dissertation for a variety of reasons on a related topic to the excavated material. I wanted to do my dissertation on plants and human understanding of plants in this particular region. So I passed my oral exam and I took intensive Thai at Berkeley. And then I went to live in Ban Chiang village for 20 months in 1979 to 1981. I was very interested in questions like, what did the ancient people living in Ban Chiang actually eat? We knew rice, but you don't live by rice alone. What else might they have been eating? What did they grow? How did they grow it? What did they collect from the wild? Now, ethnobotany cannot provide the final answers, but they can raise possibilities that excavation cannot address by itself. And I felt a bit differently. Some archaeologists feel that the only thing that counts is what they dig up. But from my point of view, I felt like we had to know more about what was actually present in the environment, even if it had poor preservation. So that's what I was interested in doing. So I worked with a principal informant, and his name was Lung Lee, and you can see him in both these pictures. On the right side, Lung Lee and I are looking at some wild rice here, and behind us is cultivated rice. So you can see that I was comparing like the environment in which the rice grew naturally, and wanted to document, when the seeds were mature, and all kinds of questions like that. And on the left side, at the house that I was living, you can see Lung Li and I are pressing plants. And I try to do a comprehensive ethnobotanical collection of edible plants in the region. And so you can see we're pressing here, and we have some things that you can't press that because they're fruits or large seeds. I had a numbering system, a cataloging system, and all of this took place in Thai language, which was, of course, one of the big challenges of doing this kind of work. I had to develop a lot of Thai language skills over the course of time before I could get understandable answers, and I could understand the answers that Lung Li was telling me. So this is just a little bit of information. At the time, there were various ideas on the origins of plant domestication in Eastern Asia. And this is one person's idea that there were zones, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can see Thailand is in 3. And there were many plants that were hypothesized to have been domesticated within zone 3, including, and I would try to go find these, both cultivated and wild versions. And so here on the lower right, you can see a domesticated yam that's called Dioscorea alata, and that were grown in gardens in the Ban Chiang area. Here you can see some taro, and this picture has Job's tears, and all of these were expected to have been domesticated in this zone 3. So that was what fascinated me. Then towards the end of, I mentioned in an earlier slide that Chet Gorman died at the end of 1981 of cancer. And while I was in the final months of my time in Ban Chiang, I got a telegram that said, go to Bangkok and help with the Smithsonian exhibit. So this led to a whole new trajectory for me. And I came back and worked with a team from the Smithsonian, editorial and design team, to develop an exhibit about Ban Chiang, which was called Ban Chiang Discovery of a Lost Bronze Age. And I think you've read some of that. So that was, again, a very strong, impactful experience. And one of the things I really valued from that experience is that I couldn't just talk about Ban Chiang academically only. I had to translate academic concepts and perspectives into an exhibit for the public. And that was, you know, as a graduate student, you're really pushed to be very esoteric and very full of jargon and lots of technical terms, and couldn't do that. I had to take those concepts and work on framing them so that the general public would not only understand, but be interested in the material. So that was a valuable life lesson for me. Then, after that was done, I was asked by the Penn Museum to drop the ethnobotany dissertation and write up Ban Chiang chronology instead, based on the knowledge that was available at that time. So I completed that in 1986. And then I continued to press forward because really we were still at the beginning of understanding Ban Chiang. So I continued to press forward on the analysis and the publications. So that was more of this dealing with bags and reconstructing pottery and drawing, I would recruit work-study students to do drawing and photography and technical analyses. And it was a long step-by-step process, which I managed to keep getting paid for. So Ban Chiang is a mixed mortuary occupation site. And one of the big jobs of an archaeologist is to develop the relative chronology and the cultural sequence. You can see here a view into one of the squares, and you can see that there are skeletons with grave goods. And here we have some more grave goods coming up, some pottery, and here's another half excavated burial. You see a grave cut in this particular location, but you also see all of these round pits. And essentially, I believe these are post holes. They are most consistent with being post holes. So developing a sequence from this interwoven occupation evidence and mortuary evidence and everything cutting into each other very densely was what I spent, I would say, a few years working on. These sites, a lot of the attention tends to go towards the burials because you have a nice time capsule with a biological remains and cultural remains and things you can reconstruct coming out of them, but not as much attention had been paid to understanding how these occupation post holes and other debris and evidence, how that fit in with the overall sequence. So this is just to give you a little view. Of course, one of the things is the ceramic sequence. And the ceramic sequence tends to focus on grave goods. And so you can see we have the early period here. There's many very distinctive shapes and decoration. Here we have some applique. And here, this is at the end of the early period. There's incised and painted designs. Some of the, oops, sorry, going back. Sorry. I'm not used to doing this. Okay, so these two pots contained infants. So you have not only pots that you want to be examining what is the sequence, but also how the pots were used in grave ritual. So in the early period, infants were buried inside pots, and most other, as you saw on the previous slide, adults and kind of later subadults would be stretched out. Also, some graves the bodies were curled up in a fetal position, and we call them flexed graves. And so during the early period, there were 3 different grave rituals and many different kinds of pots that I ultimately put into a sequence of 5 phases. Then the middle period, the grave ritual changed, and you can see all these very fine small sherds. And that's because during this period, they broke the sherds, they broke the pots over the bodies. And so the individuals would be covered with sheets of sherds. And when we put them together, which really took years, we found some very distinctive shapes that are unique to Ban Chiang. For example, this one is quite an unusual, I call it hyperbolic, but informally, I like to call them 3 Mile Island pots, because the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident took place while we were putting together the pots, and the pots look like cooling towers. So archaeologists often have like lingo that they use informally to comment about something, but then you can't publish, oh, these are 3 Mile Island pots. So we call them, I ultimately called it hyperbolic pots. And this late period is when the red painted pottery that you've seen examples of was found. But here are some examples of other types of forms that were in the late period. Okay, so I moved on to monograph publication after getting a wonderful grant from the Luce Foundation, which is devoted to monographs. And that really provided a foundation for, like, let's say, up until the present, for a big advance on monographs. Yeah, you might wonder, well, why go to all that bother? Why do a monograph? Why not just do an article in Archaeological Science or something like that? Well, the monographs are, I'm a real devotee of monographs. They provide the reference, the fundamental reference books for a site. And a site like Ban Chiang, which was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1992, deserves the most solid reference books that can be put together. So one of the important bodies of data or evidence from the site were the skeletons. There were 142 named burials at the site. And Chet Gorman had asked Mike Petraszewski at a very young age, but an early professor at the University of Hawaii, to do the skeletal analysis. And he is the only scholar, collaborator that stuck it out after Chet died to complete his analysis. And he also got one of his graduate students, Michelle Tomei Douglas, to take the collection on as her dissertation. So there's all kinds of fascinating things you can tell about individuals, about societies, about populations from the analysis of skeletons. And so they wrote this wonderful book that studies things like, for example, here we see the underneath the eye orbit. You can see these holes. And those holes are a response to anemia. Now, there can be many causes of anemia, which is a blood disorder. Some of the causes can be genetic, but they can also be dietary. There's all kinds of things, but this is the first time it was really documented systematically in a group of skeletons, in a skeletal series. There's all kinds of things you can tell in teeth. So for example, over here, there are little bumps that can occur on teeth when they are developing and there's an interruption, such as a disease process. So you can look at where, that since teeth develop in a very highly specific time frame within ages of years and months, you can look at a population and say, oh wow, these children were having stress around age 4 more than age 2. And so something like that might indicate something like weaning, a weaning age. So they really introduced numerous fundamental approaches to studying skeletal series, and that was introduced in our monograph. And so that is the first monograph that we were able to publish using the Luce Foundation funds. Now, archaeologists are supposed to not only publish, but we're supposed to be doing field work. So I knew I had plenty on my hands to do just the publication, but there was an opportunity to work, to co-direct with Lisa Kellefer, some coring of lakes in Thailand. So we founded the Thailand Paleo Environment Project. We cored 3 lakes in 3 different locations in Thailand, trying to get, all locations had some archaeological significance, but they were different latitudes, different altitudes, and we wanted to get a baseline study of vegetation changes in those 3 locations. So that was the main field work I did during the 1990s, and we published several things from that. And those references are still, even though there's now begun to be more coring work, and the cores are studied for things like pollen changes, and Lisa studied the phytolith changes. Those studies are still foundational for studying vegetation history in Thailand. And I have to laugh, I get in academia.edu, we can find out who is citing the work. And one of the most popular types of disciplines that cite this work are mosquito studies. So not so much, somewhat archaeology, but the mosquito studies have been studying this work regularly for decades now. around 2000, the Penn Museum director was pushing me to do more regular archaeological fieldwork, and particularly in Laos. And in Laos was just opening up. And I had always kind of said to myself, okay, I mostly want to work. I'm, very interested in understanding Northeast Thailand in depth. And if I ever wanted to work elsewhere, I would like to work in Laos because it's on the other side of the river. And it really was closed for decades. Even during the Indochina period, very little was done, just bits and pieces. But I figured that we can only really understand Ban Chiang culture if we know what's going on in Laos. And I should also say that other archaeological projects had looked south to southern Northeast Thailand. They'd looked in this area. They tried to find connections over here, and basically no connection to Ban Chiang in terms of looking at a source culture had been identified in Thailand. So when Laos started opening up kind of in the late 1990s, just that there was a short Australian project, just a little bit of glimmerings of openings. I was receptive to the idea of the director to investigate if I could start a project in Laos. So I did in 2001, December, what I call a rapid assessment archaeological survey. And I knew at that time, I mean, there was, Laos is still extremely poor, but it was really poor. And so I felt that I needed to look where there, in an area that there would be some resources, like some electricity. So having spent a lot of time in this Ban Chiang area, I chose two areas to assess. And in those days, you could only get a visa for 2 weeks. So I contacted the director of the Heritage Department. I had met him at a conference in Paris a few years earlier. And I asked him how would it be, would it be possible, or would there be interest in Laos for a collaboration between the Penn Museum and the Lao Heritage Department to do some archaeological work? And he replied, come and visit, let's see. And I explained that I wanted to look in those two areas, basically an area near Vientiane, which is the capital of Laos, and then another city, Luang Prabang, upstream, because I figured that if we're going to be trying to understand something about Ban Chiang, which is part of the rationale for working in this area, we needed to basically look immediately across the Mekong and then upstream to get a sense. So I went to Laos, and I was assigned a collaborator, Bun Huang Boasasing Pasut. And he and I did, this line is actually in the wrong place. We should be just over here on the other side. We did 5 transects by truck. And every night, the night before, I had paper maps, and I would scour the maps for where I thought sites might be based on the landscape, my knowledge of where sites were in this part of the drainage basin. So we did these 5 transects, one a day. There's always a bit of time to get going, and sometimes you can't do it every day and that kind of thing. And we found sites, but it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. And he said, well, wait till we go to Luang Prabang, we'll find lots of sites. So by this time, there was only 2.5 days left. So we flew up to Luang Prabang, And in those 2.5 days, I saw evidence of 10,000 years of human occupation of this area, which is not a typical experience for an archaeologist. It was like amazing. I saw, as one piece of evidence, polished stone adzes were extremely common in the market. Ban Chiang's polished stone adzes are teeny little things next to these beautifully, developed, large, shouldered in some cases, beveled, tons of these polished stone adzes. I visited a cave site that had clearly had early Holocene, what we call Hoabinhian lithics. That site had been excavated by the director of the Heritage Department. I saw also eroding out of the side of the Mekong, a site that had pottery that I could tell was Neolithic up until the current historic, the recent historic period. So, so this is what it's really impressed me, that Luang Prabang, there was something very exciting from an archaeological and from a human settlement history point of view in this city. So I went back to, well, first of all, of course, the next problem is you have to raise money. So, so I went back to the maps. I said I will want to work in Luang Prabang. And I studied the maps and I noticed that 3 major tributaries come into the Mekong near Luang Prabang. The Khan here drains, see this Trunin Plateau? That is where the Plain of Jars exists. I don't know if you've read about that yet, but so the Khan drains the Annamite Cordillera, this large mountain range, and the Plain of Jars, and comes in actually right at Luang Prabang city. Then we have the Seung, which also drains the west side of the Annamite Cordillera a little bit further north. And then we have the U River, which drains from southern China, right here. So I thought, okay, let's also look at what's going on the other side of the Cordillera. And we have the Ma River draining, interdigitating with the Seung and the Khan. This is a classic area of Hoabinhian sites in Vietnam. And so I had the makings of a proposal that sought to examine this Middle Mekong area near Luang Prabang as a crossroads, because of course we also have the Mekong coming in from the west and then going south. So we have all sorts of reasons why people were coming together over long periods of time and passing through this region or settling in this region, and all to be determined by some solid archaeological research. So I could, but before I could raise the funds, I needed to check with the Lao government, would it be okay? Because often archaeologists are expected to focus on one site or one river or one rather small, narrowly defined topic. And so I made a second trip to discuss this with the Heritage Department. And I said, I want to survey all 3 rivers simultaneously. And I explained my rationale. We could pick the wrong river, and end up with nothing. It would be better to do some kind of very rapid type of survey and assess the 3 rivers at the same time. And then perhaps we would find a site that we could begin a testing program with. So I got permission to do that. And I applied to the National Geographic Society, and I don't know if they still exist, but the National Science Foundation had a high-risk program. Now, high risk could be anything from not likely to get permission to environmentally dangerous, or all kinds of reasons. So we checked numerous boxes there. Might not get permission, environmentally dangerous. It could be we could fall off a cliff. We could come down with malaria. So anyways, I got funding from both, and that funded the first survey, which took place in 2005. And we found 58 sites in 3 weeks. And then as we built upon it over time, as of now, we have 100 sites in Luang Prabang. And you can see the most recent survey took place up the U. We had to take we could drive so far, and then we had to take a boat. And then we worked from there. So our next step is we want to connect this part of the U with further down in the U. But we surveyed the Sung, there's the Ba and the Kan and some other surveys. So we now have quite a lot of sites that we found, prehistoric, historic. The idea is to record everything that we find to understand a settlement history of this particular area. So, and then we began doing test excavations. We did 4 test excavations on different tributaries. And that's a whole nother talk, but just to give you one picture, this was our most spectacular cave site that we tested, Tum An Ma. And that's all I'm going to say on that, just to give you a visual. So another thing, and a lot of this was allowed by another Luce Foundation grant. And one of my philosophies is to try as much as possible to bring in the highest level technical capability as possible. So I had a chance to bring in a cave paleoclimate team. And so here you see Mick Griffiths, who at that time was in Australia, and he is now a professor in New Jersey, to take speleothems from which paleoclimate can be reconstructed. So, or at least rainfall, or at least precipitation. So this has been actually our most successful part of the work so far, in that they found within our zone a 40,000 year climate record. And various pieces of it had been published, but the one of which I was among the collaborators was the one that pointed out this Middle Holocene mega drought. And it coincided with a period that I have been calling the missing millennia, because there was a gap in the archaeological record between about 5,500 and 4,000 years ago. And I had not been thinking up until, this is the most surprising thing that has come out of the work, is that I had been thinking, well, we just didn't understand where people were living. And while that's part of the story, that there was a cessation of development of speleothems in this time frame gives a whole nother picture to what might have been happening for humans and all kinds of biological entities in this very dry period. So in the meantime, I was downsized by the Penn Museum in 2013 when they completed downsizing their research staff. This happened to a lot of museums. But I had a small set of supporters who wanted to see my work in Thailand and Laos continue, and particularly the publication of Ban Chiang monographs. And their pledges for 5 years enabled me to found a baby nonprofit, the Institute for Southeast Asian Archaeology, and the museum allowed me to keep some space, and I was able to have some income and pay some collaborators, which allowed us to finish the Ban Chiang medalist monograph suite of 4 volumes, the 4th just hitting the warehouse last month. I know you've already read a lot about this, but I'll just show a few slides. Quality work, quality archaeological work takes working as with teams over the long haul. And so Elizabeth Hamilton and I put together with a few other authors a very large manuscript. which ultimately became the 4 books about the metallurgical evidence, not only at Ban Chiang, but 3 other sites that had been excavated by the Penn Museum, small excavations, test excavations, plus synthesize it with regard to other metallurgical evidence in Thailand. So although there was a lot of technical work done early on, it wasn't done in a consistent manner. So Dr. Hamilton completely reassessed the whole assemblage from a technical, typological, et cetera, point of view. So you saw in the catalog that, of course, generally archaeologists are if we're giving an exhibition, we're going to focus on the intact artifacts, which generally come from graves. And bangles and small implements, mostly bangles, were the common find from the site of Ban Chiang and similar sites. So I'd like to point out now the difference between an art historical versus an archaeological approach to objects. Final products, preferably intact, nice looking, would characterize what I call an art historical approach. But as archaeologists, we really want a complete holistic understanding. And that includes products from all contexts, not just burial, all states of manufacture, and all conditions. We call this the life history approach. So if we look, for example, at where we have objects that can be assigned a function. So we have bangles, you can see that's a big hunk, tiny bit of bells, tiny bit of adzes, a few blades, a few points. But the vast majority, 3/4 of the assemblage, were not identifiable to a function. And if we look at contexts, we find that grave goods were only 10% of the collection. This context called burial associated would be things found while excavating a grave, but not necessarily a grave good. So if you found, a fragment in the grave fill, we call that burial associated. And then feature contexts, which would be post holes, hearths, that kind of thing. But the vast majority, 66%, 2/3, came from the general soil matrix. So I have long thought that the top-down approach to looking at the Bronze Age was problematic. But how to develop an alternative view has really occupied, let's say, the last 20 years or so of my life, and working with the development of the monographs. So I put in place a few papers to start developing the theory. In the late 90s, the 80s and 90s, the top-down view to archaeology really predominated. Everybody was looking for hierarchy and inequality and all of this. And I just didn't see it in the data. And so there was a concept called heterarchy that became of interest sort of in the mid-90s. So I did a piece on that. And then looking at economic organization, I quickly saw that something called the community craft production was applicable to Thailand. I did a paper on that. And 2 colleagues, including Elizabeth Hamilton, introduced me to a whole body of literature called the Anthropology of Technology. And that is what we have built the 4-volume monograph series on. Here you see 2A and 2B. You had one chapter from 2A, then there's 2C and now 2D. And this has proposed a completely revised approach to studying metals and studying them in particular at sites like Ban Chiang and other prehistoric sites in Thailand. So the salient patterns, in my view, of the Metal Age is community specialization. There's not a single supply or distribution network, but multiple redundant supply and distribution networks. The role of metal, it could be a valuable, but I think the evidence shows it was used in daily life by villagers. There is enduring and marked cultural diversity throughout the sequence. going back to the skeletons, we have healthy populations despite some variation in wealth. There was enduring peace, and the growth and complexity did increase, but via social and economic diversification and integration, i.e. heterarchy. So I just want to give one little example of how, if we take a more holistic view of metals, the kind of information that we can get. And I'd like to focus on crucibles. Crucibles, such as the one you see in the picture here, are a key piece of evidence that shows how the economies and production functioned. And we find that these red triangles here are some examples of where small spouted crucibles, or rather their fragments mostly, were found at average villages throughout Northeast Thailand. And there's at least one occurrence in central Thailand. And this evidence shows that casting occurred not in centralized workshops, but in everyday average villages. And that's, I think, a rather important contribution that Thai prehistory is making. In addition, recently, we've gotten evidence from lead isotope analyses about the redundant and multiple networks. And fascinatingly, we find some of the objects in Ban Chiang got their copper in Laos. Of course, it wasn't Laos then, but at a site called Sepon, based on the signature, and another site, which I know you've read about, excavated since Ban Chiang, Ban Non Wat, they got their early copper from a different ore source, the Khawang Pajang Valley. Now, there's a lot more work that needs to be done to flesh out more details, but just those hints give you a sense of how different prehistoric sites were relating to different ore sources in the deep past. So in all of this evidence together shows that there was a decentralized specialization, and that this decentralized system could promote regional exchange systems. We also know from the pottery work that we've done, this community specialization is happening with the pottery as well. So we find dispersed but networked production, which is what is promoting regional growth and peace. Inequalities exist, but the regional system as a whole existed for, I think, in my view, at least 2,000 years. How could a decentralized metal technological system exist? Well, one of the unique aspects of Southeast Asia is that there is a very complicated plate tectonic system where there are numerous plates and pieces of plates bumping into each other. And it's those intersections that are conducive to the development of ores. And we demonstrate this in one of our chapters. And as a result, if you see Ban Chiang here, and the reddish squares are modern day copper sources, and the yellow is tin sources, you can see that Northeast Thailand was surrounded by copper and tin potential sources, of which we've just begun to excavate other projects, some of those sources to demonstrate prehistoric development. So it's an area with unusually rich ore sources that helps to explain why metallurgy developed in the region the way it did. And so in volume 2C, we synthesize all of this evidence with 34 additional sites, and this gives you a sense of really trying to pull all the data available together, admittedly in English, into a coherent picture. Okay, on to Operation Antiquity. So I've given a talk I call Hot Pots, Museum Raids, and the Race to Uncover Asia's Archaeological Past, and selected a few slides from that effort. This all began in 2005 when I received a phone call, and I answered the phone, and they said, a guy said, "Hello, this is the Department of Homeland Security looking for Joyce White." Now, this wasn't that far away from 9/11. And so I'm wondering, what on earth is it? What do they want? So I said, I think you have the wrong number. Then they said, well, are you Joyce? Is your name Joyce White? I said, yes. And they said, are you an expert in Ban Chiang? And I said, yes. And they said, well, we're working on a smuggling case and we need your expertise. So they flew me out a few weeks later to Los Angeles to ID some artifacts and testify to the grand jury. At this point, the undercover investigation had already been underway for 2 or 3 years. So I passed, they showed that I was knowledgeable. And then for the next couple of years, I would be sent pictures like this to authenticate. Now, some things you cannot authenticate by photograph, but these were pretty easy. And you can see how they came in. Made in Thailand would be slapped on the different objects that they recovered from ports of entry. So this was going along. And then in December 2007, I received another call that my presence was required at a raid. And I had been thinking all of this was going on in Los Angeles, and instead I was sent to Chicago on January 23rd. And I participated in the kind of the presentation the day before the raid as to what the raid was all about. And the raid was a man's personal museum and his personal collection. And this is where they tell the law enforcement officers, this is the law enforcement officers, that no, we will not bang down the door, we will ask for the keys. And there's a whole sequence of what is involved in this kind of raid. And I was to stay in the car until, and I have a lot of stories about this, of course, until the place was secure. And then I had to quickly, within a few hours, go through the collection and indicate, what's authentic, approximate age or period, and basically they then seize that material. And so the next day, it was really cold, and I, with 100+ law enforcement officers, wait for the go from Los Angeles, where the command station was. And simultaneously, when we got the go, then several museums in California and warehouses were also raided. Here we have the Bowers Museum in the picture. And their relevant collections were then either seized, or the museums like the Bowers was told they had to take everything off exhibit that was on exhibit and kind of sequester that component of their collections for eventual evaluation. So I only got to spend one sort of day in Chicago. We didn't get through the whole part. And then I was sent to, and this is just another scene in Chicago. Everybody had guns, and not so concealed, or sometimes up somebody's pant leg. It was like quite a scene. And this is just to give you a sense of what the McLean collection looked like. Some really spectacular examples. No labels, just pictures, just pots on shelves, as I like to call it. But then I was flown to LA the next day to start going through museum collections. And also I spent much of my time on this visit and additional visits in the ice warehouse, where the smugglers' collection had been transported. And the main thing I want to say about this is it's an incredibly depressing experience, because I, as an archaeologist, feel all of the loss of knowledge that has happened because these objects were removed from their in situ contexts. And so it was a very, very depressing. It's a vast destruction of knowledge. And to give you a sense of the scale of damage that I mean, this isn't all the collections in the United States. This is just, what's going on in Los Angeles from some places. During the Penn FAD excavations at Ban Chiang, only one bronze adze, I'll show you a picture of it in another picture, was excavated. The smuggler had more than 250 copper alloy axes, and more than 300 were seized in this one case. So a vast amount of looting had to have occurred to recover that many adzes. So I know you've read up on the case, but just let's review it quickly. So antiquities were illegally imported into the United States with false declarations, like made in Thailand. They ended up with dealers, collectors, and museums. So the recipients are receiving stolen property, since it was demonstrated that it was against the law for these materials to have left Thailand. Tax fraud occurred when inflated commercial values were assigned to museum donations. So there's tax fraud. And individual items may have had modest commercial value, but the scale of the case is in the multi-millions of dollars. And this is where I am supposed to, as at one stage, I'm told, okay, you now have to evaluate the monetary value. And so I said, well, I don't know anything about commercial value. I don't do that. The only thing I'm willing to do, and thankfully this is what the law actually wanted me to do, is to look at archaeological value. What would it have taken to scientifically excavate, study, and publish the seized materials? So when we go back to our one adze found in the Ban Chiang FAD excavations, they were not huge, but they were significant excavations, and which was recovered in 650 cubic meters. And the main smuggler had more than 250 copper alloy adzes. When you calculate all out, getting specialists and writing everything up and excavating the equivalent of, basically 250 times what Penn excavated, and the damage was easily in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you calculate just by the adzes, the damage was in the billions of dollars. And that does not even include the loss to the Thai economy in terms of village development or any of that. So it's a massive, massive destruction of Thai archaeological sites. Very depressing. So did any good come out of this? So the first thing that happened quite quickly was an association called the Association of Art Museum Directors woke up and revised their guidelines on acquisitions to have kind of a cutoff point. They focused on the 1970 UNESCO convention, that anything imported more recently than that should not be accessioned. So that actually was a major outcome, that there was this kind of wake-up call. Museums cannot exist when there's 500 law enforcement officers closing them down because of illegal acquisitions. Some of the artifacts did go back, like the Bowers Museum, which was actually the most complicit example. They did return 500 of objects, more than 500 objects. And that was following many stories here, but essentially they signed a non-prosecution agreement, and that the US government agreed not to prosecute them if they returned everything to Thailand. So they did that. And one of the other museums repatriated a smaller collection. Another big outcome was that there was, in addition to the main smuggler, there was a kind of a middleman, or middleman, or middle man and woman, the Markells, a couple who were instrumental in getting objects from the main smuggler and having them donated to museums, and they facilitated the inflated tax write-offs. And so the government did stick to this case. And I was at the, they negotiated and they avoided and on and on and on. Finally, they agreed they had to plead guilty. And so I was present at the sentencing. And they'd already done some pre-negotiation in a variety of ways. And so I was brought up to the stand to explain the significance of the case. And to give you a little tiny tidbit, in the negotiation, the Markells got to choose their judge, and they chose the judge that had a reputation for never putting people in jail. But mostly this judge dealt with like drugs and that kind of thing. But this was a different kind of case. So I explained, giving the example of the adzes. And I said that this is a landmark case. And to everybody's utter astonishment, the husband was sent to jail for 18 months. It may be the first time an antiquity dealer has actually served jail time. And I believe that, we'll get to the I believe part in a bit. A heartbreaking outcome is that all of the McLean's items were returned to him. And this had to do with the legal glitches on the Department of Justice side and the particular people involved. And I have to say that's really heartbreaking. But since the Ban Chiang Operation Antiquity case, I think you may have noticed there's been a big increase in US cases targeting not only museums, but also dealers. And this all began with Operation Antiquity. So that's my talk.